and welcome to Picturing Mexican America. I'm Marissa López. I'm professor of English and Chicano Studies at UCLA, and if you're watching this, then you know who I am, and you know what Picturing Mexican America is and what we're all about, and if you forgot, you can go see the link in our Instagram bio for a refresher. So a premise of ours is that the past is always alive in the present. We're always experiencing the past. And on Instagram, I've had a series of conversations with artists and scholars and thinkers and activists about the different ways that we make sense of that past. And today I'm joined by Professor David Torres-Rouff of UC Merced to talk about what role the built environment plays in our experience of ourselves and the spaces that we move in. And this is actually a re-recording of a conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago on Instagram Live. My phone liked so much it decided to eat it. So the video just disappeared, unfortunately, but it was such a great conversation and we had so many viewers and so much engagement that we wanted to re-record it. Professor Torres-Rouff, David, you were kind enough to carve out some time in your very, very busy life to re-record, so thank you. And thanks for being with us. So I'm gonna do your introduction, so I can tell you all about yourself. David is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of History and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Merced, where he studies the intersection of people, policy, and place in the North American Southwest from the 17th through the 19th centuries. And today, we're gonna be talking about David's first book, Before LA, Race, Space, and gotta double check the subtitle, Municipal Power in Los Angeles. But his current project, Emerging from the Rubble, Chinese in Merced, California, that's connected to this first book in interesting ways, and I hope we have time to chat about that too. So Emerging from the Rubble harnesses local archives to spatially reconstruct the American Chinese community in Merced during the late 19th century. So together with me, and a bunch of other amazing people, David serves on Mayor Eric Garcetti's Civic Memory Working Group in Los Angeles. And this is something that I've never been able to do. David has been a fellow at the Henry E. Huntington Library in San Marino, California. So David, thank you for making time. And for
Marissa, my pleasure.
And thanks for sitting through that, blah, blah, blah. I am really honored to have this second chance to sit down and talk with you about your work and about the city that we both know and love so much, Los Angeles. So before we get started, like, how are you doing? When we talked a couple weeks ago, it had been a week and it has been a couple of weeks. Today, we were talking on June 10th, 2020. How was your week, David?
My week was good, very interesting. You know, it's another opportunity to try to figure out how to listen to my colleagues, listen to people in my community, listen to parents in my son's school, listen to my friends from all over the place, both in person and over Instagram. You know, and not that a person forgets. Well, I feel like I try to be a person who doesn't forget, but to always remember that as a white person, the work of anti-racism, of deconstructing our own white privilege, of sharing that in the world, it's a practice. It's not a journey with a destination. It's a path we walk. And it's been an incredible week to see or a few weeks really, just to see the outpouring, to really have the time to invest and to read and to listen, to catch up with people, and then also to strategize. I've been thinking a lot at multiple scales this week about the notion of opportunity, right? And these moments which do come around, which are historically significant, and how to not keep them from fading, because that does happen, but how to claim and take as much of the opportunity from the moment as possible. And what does that mean to organize? How can I help? And what are the things I shouldn't do to help? I think also have been really clearly just as important right now. And so it's been a good opportunity, I think, to listen, to think about the work in this book, the work I continue to do, my work at University of California, Merced, and to think about what we can achieve in those agendas. And it's been, I think, a little bit more inspiring and empowering this week than it was the week before this week.
And of course, we are speaking in the midst of nationwide, worldwide, really, protests over police brutality, anti-Black violence, and the murder of George Foley, and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and many, many others. But these are the three most visible catalyzers of the action in the streets. Has Merced been active? Do you have?
Merced has been active. There was a small protest at the County Courthouse Museum. There was a fabulous town hall yesterday that was actually moderated. It was orchestrated between the city leadership, so the chief of police, the mayor, members of the city council, our state assemblyman, people from the University of California, Merced, and the local branch of the NAACP. My incredible colleague in sociology, Whitney Pirtle, was able to be the moderator. And so I think that like those moments are good. Of course, you know, we really hope that people who run the institutions of the city and the state took more time to educate themselves over the last few weeks and to like start thinking about solutions and answers. But I think the Central Valley, which generally is a place that like since the core of the UFW strikes has been a quieter place for protest, you know, like I think 5,000 people marched in Turlock. There's been big demonstrations in Fresno and Bakersfield. And then of course, further up the valley, you have Sacramento, right, and the state capital, which has obviously been a place of a great locus of activity. So it is exciting to see this connection, at least, you know, as a person who principally lives in the world of the academy, for better and for worse, right? But to see students, faculty, staff, community members start thinking about how to strategize together to change the communities in which they live.
Well, let's go back in time on this question of community and turn to your book, which I think gives us some really useful tools for thinking about this present moment. So let's move backwards to go forward. So we, in the post that we initially had on our Instagram feed advertising this talk, we mentioned, or we featured, James Toberman's victory over Cristobál Aguilar in LA's 1872 mayoral election. And we talked a little bit about how it changed the nature of LA politics. So I thought we could open with that and could tell us a little bit about that election and kind of unpack that for us.
Yeah, it's a really interesting election in 1872. So I mean, the immediate contexts are three, right? One is that it's 1 year after the anti-Chinese massacre in Los Angeles of 1871. If you don't know about it, in October of 1871, there was there had been before it this sort of simmering tension between everyone in Los Angeles who wasn't Chinese and the Chinese community, issues about violence in the streets, about manipulation of the courts, and there comes to be this moment where there's an outbreak of gun violence that involves the police and then leads to a besiegement of a building full of Chinese people and the lynching of an execution, usually in frequently grisly fashion, of 19 Chinese residents of Los Angeles. It's a big deal. The news of it is telegraphed to San Francisco. It knocks the Great Fire of Chicago off the front page of the New York Times. It's the first time that Los Angeles appears really in the New York Times and including all the way into the newspapers in London, right? So this is a moment of visibility for Los Angeles that its boosters and the people who sort of envision this incredible city really regret. And that issue of regret and what the future is going to look like looms large in the 1872 election. The other element is that we have, in Los Angeles by that time, there had come to be a new wave of European American immigrants who started to gain critical mass, who had not been in Los Angeles earlier, and who had not, you know, been inculcated in anything like what we think of today as like a mixed race or intercultural community. And they became quite intolerant with the way business as usual was in Los Angeles. And then the other sort of key signpost is that it had been announced that the Southern Pacific Railroad would be expanding to Los Angeles, and the link to San Francisco would connect Los Angeles to the Transcontinental Railroad. And so there was this sense of the imminent futurity of Los Angeles. And in that context, you have an election between James Toberman, who's one of these arriviste newcomer European Americans, And Cristobál Aguilar, who's a long-term resident of Los Angeles, has enjoyed a broad-based support. He won handily the 1870 election, where the majority of support came from European Americans because there was already a strong European American demographic majority in Los Angeles. So he won anyway. But in 1872, Toberman ran on this campaign backed by the Los Angeles Star, the main newspaper, that framed the contest as progress versus stagnation, the city of the future versus the city of the past, an infrastructurally sophisticated city that was clean as opposed to one that was backwards and dirty. And then those ideas got mapped onto the candidates, right? One who was American, one who was Mexican, and onto language. One who was an English speaker and one who was principally a Spanish speaker. And so this kind of brought a new level of racism to politics and to a mayoral election in Los Angeles that had not really been present very often. And strongly linked this notion of the future lies with white people and this sort of dirty past lies with Spanish-speaking Mexican people. And it became contested and nasty, and Toberman prevailed. That he found, in a way that's like not unfamiliar to us thinking about 2016, a way to appeal to voters that got them to change their understanding of the place of Mexican people in the city. And that had, what they didn't know then is that it had real significant consequences going forward into the future, right? Antonio Villaraigosa was the next Mexican-American mayor of Los Angeles over, what, 120 years later, so.
Mm-hmm. And in your book, and you talk about this in the introduction, and you set up the 1872 election as the sort of the moment, the start of a kind of slide into something that happens in 1894, the first, the fiesta, La Fiesta, which is both where you begin and end your book. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about La Fiesta and why, I think you say something like La Fiesta, which happens in 1894, it would have been unthinkable in 1870, but by 1872 makes it possible. So can you unpack all those claims for us?
Yeah, sure. So I start with La Fiesta, which happens in 1894 as a point of entry to the story, in an effort to kind of like not start with a date, but to start by telling a tale, and have at least the beginning of the book not be so boring. And so the Fiesta de los Ángeles is planned by this group called the Merchants Association, which basically is the forerunner of the Chamber of Commerce in Los Angeles. Between 1872 and 1894, the railroad did come. The city spent elaborately on infrastructure, albeit in specific places. The level of business grew. There was a very famous land boom in Los Angeles in the late 1880s because of the transcontinental railroads and a fare war. And like, for any of you who ever grew up in the Midwest and experienced a 78-degree February day in Los Angeles, when there's a $1 train ticket and easily available land like this, becomes really appealing. That boom had busted majestically and spectacularly in the early 1890s, and had deepened with a national economic crisis in 1893. So the Merchants Association, many of whom not only have businesses but real estate interests, are looking for a way to recover themselves, to regain their footing, to get away from their branding as like these failed marketeers of the city of Los Angeles. And they seize on something like the Chicago World's Fair. Like, they look at Chicago and they're like, wow, this is really successful. Chicago's the city we want to be like. There's the Midwinter Fair also in San Francisco, which is really effective as a thing that attracts business, draws in tourists, and recruits new settlers to the city. But they want to do it in this self-styled original format. And so they settle on this notion of La Fiesta, a way to invoke the town's Spanish and of course always never Mexican past, to create this festival atmosphere. And so that's, to me, what happens at La Fiesta is why I start with it and end with it. La Fiesta starts with this sort of like armed occupation of the city and the mayor's abdication to the queen of La Fiesta. But of course, this is like fake and symbolic, but it's interesting in my thinking about it because of all the occupations of Los Angeles. This is the one that sort of seals this whole past and creates this new usable future for people who are boosters. So how does that work? they have a history parade in which they sort of show off for the first time this revised history of the city of Los Angeles that goes from like docile but ignorant women to wise and enlightened Spanish missionaries, skipping over the Mexican period entirely into like mining, early city days, booms and busts, and then prophesies this future of solid progress, right, which is the last float in the parade. And so they kind of splash out on the streets this new way of thinking about Los Angeles' history. It's also an opportunity to develop this notion of the Spanish past, and to solicit participation from local indigenous groups, including the city's Chinese merchants, who put on a marvelous and expensive show to bring in indigenous people, not only from Southern California, but from like Yuma, Arizona, to perform a very non-local version of Indianness. And to me, this is important because it basically shows that the way brown bodies could be limited and harmed, but also commoditized and sold as part of like the dream of Los Angeles, right? To have all these different people of the world perform for you and to be at your disposal and make you feel like you've lived in a rich and cosmopolitan place. And that was part of the new marketing of Los Angeles.
Can you tell us a little bit about the title, or explain the title for us? Because what you're describing in 1872 and 1894 as these like catalysts, to use that word again, that kind of set your story in motion. So thinking about moving forward into the future, but then your book is called Before LA. So tell us, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I came to it kind of two ways. One is there's a book by Richard Rodriguez called Days of Obligation, an argument with my Mexican father. And he's a controversial figure. So, but this is a very interesting sentence he writes, which is that Americans have their leveling ways. La ciudad de Nuestra Señora de la Reina de Los Ángeles de Porciúncula has become, in 100 years, LA, right? So part of the book is to like slow down the speed of that compression from something big and complicated and with a particular history to just like the two letters, right? Mm-hmm. The other thing is that as I started researching this book and as I wrote it, there was a surge in the field of human geography and urban studies to make Los Angeles sort of like the new darling model city of urban studies. And that's very much influenced by postmodernism. So whereas like Chicago is the model city for urban studies, it is a sort of city of very much classic modernism, and it is championed by the sociologists who trained at the University of Chicago as this model. By the late 1990s, as a result of the cultural turn and its influence in the fields of urban studies and human geography, people start looking at issues more of diversity and complexity and multiplicity. And people start seizing on Los Angeles as this new model to think about, right? This new way to think about diversity, sprawl, like this mixed urban suburban kind of model. And there was a tremendous fluorescence of work and publications in this field. If you read Ed Soja, Mike Davis, the list goes very deep. Michael Deere, people at USC, people at UCLA, people throughout the country. Much of this work, however, took Los Angeles in the late 1890s or early 20th century as a thing that was already fully formed. There's almost no interrogation of its deeper past. It sort of springs like Athena from the head of Zeus, ready to roll, and to be this model for the new urban studies. And so I actually think that a lot of the ideas and the analytical modes that these folks bring to bear are useful, but my effort was to try to bring them to bear on this earlier period of Los Angeles history. And so since that has sort of come to be known, the LA School of Urban Studies, that was part of what I was trying to get at, is like, how do we think about this earlier period of Los Angeles to inform a richer and deeper sense of the city's history?
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna read yourself to yourself, and I'm gonna read a paragraph that I think sums up your book in a nutshell. And for those of you who are lucky enough to have your very own copy of Before LA, I'm reading on page 256, from 256 to 257. This is in the conclusion. And I think as I read, viewers will hear echoes of what you've just been saying, but also this paragraph sort of introduces the infrastructural element to your argument, right? The thing that you're hanging this all on, which is sewers. So we're gonna get into that. So sewers and paved streets rarely found their way into Mexican and Chinese neighborhoods. Oh, you know what? Silly me. That is the wrong page. No, it's the right page. We're recording this at 10 o'clock at night, everybody. It's been a long day and a long week for everyone. I will go on. I even have my little post-it here and my arrow. Here we go. Sewers and paved streets rarely found their way into Mexican and Chinese neighborhoods. Consequently, public policy translated dynamic, socially negotiated identities into frozen infrastructural realities, producing a place full of spaces that marked off social difference. Once built, inequalities in the city's infrastructure dictated and reflected the articulation of racial identities in Los Angeles society more generally. These new spaces made the labels Mexican, Chinese, and white meaningful beyond the realms of talk, name-calling, and political power. Having become embedded in the city's physical environment, built into its very streets, buildings, and pipes, the spatial corollaries of Mexican, Chinese, and white social status would also thereafter be part of any future renegotiation, adding unprecedented durability and rigidity to previously fragile and fluid arrangements, which it's just a beautiful paragraph. And I want to say that that was a very academic set of sentences that I had just read, but such beautiful writing. And this book tells such an amazing story. I mean, it's academic, it's published by Yale University Press. It hits all the high notes that you need to hit when you're a professor writing a book. But anybody could pick this up and really enjoy it. So explain that for us. Unpack those sentences for us. I think that's like the fourth time I've said unpack, but summarize what I just said, what I just read, and kind of open that up for us. How is that the story of your whole book in a nutshell?
Well, thanks. I think that's really the story of like the whole book, because of the effort to try to think through the ways that the decisions people make about space, whether that, like, if we think of that as, well, we can think of space so many ways, so I'll specify, right? About land, about water, about public space, right? What do we do in a plaza or a park? Are tethered to ideas and beliefs that people have about race and identity, and they're interpreted through the medium of public policy frequently. So in that particular section of the book, what I'm talking about is the sea change that's happened in Los Angeles between 1872 and 1894. And as I alluded to earlier, I spent a lot of time earlier in the book talking about the ways that Spanish Mexicans, people who came to colonize Los Angeles, who were themselves mestizo people, came to understand themselves in particular ways as sons and daughters of the land, as hijos and hijas del país, an entirely audacious self-identification for people who had migrated from central Mexico and Sonora with mixed blood, and plopped themselves down in the mix of Gabrielino Tongva Indians, right? Who were the actual sons and daughters of the land. But they had forged through the difficult process of first early European adventurer migration and then the colonization of Los Angeles by the United States of America, a locally functioning, workable intercultural community where people with Spanish Mexican backgrounds, including Indian and African backgrounds, dark-skinned Spanish speakers, worked with people from the United States who even came from the South and believed in the one-drop rule, to find a way to share power, to share different Spanish Mexican and American ways of thinking about land, of thinking about water, of thinking about space and how to use it and what was appropriate to do in it. And it had never been easy, because as we're all learning now, this work is never easy, but it had worked, and it hadn't worked in a golden age kind of way. It was ugly a lot of the time. A lot of what got them together was their willingness to be really, really, really aggressively violent against poor people of color, poor white people. Mm-hmm. But starting in that 1872 election and going forward into the 1870s, two things happened at the same time, which is, one, you have more and more race talk, more and more of this equation of backwards, dirty, early with brown and Mexican and Spanish. And at the same time, the city starts unequally developing the infrastructure. So they spend a great deal of time and money building a sewer system, paving streets, developing business districts. But all of this municipal investment goes to places that are inhabited almost exclusively by European Americans. And so the argument that I'm trying to make at the end of the book is, like, if I could summarize it as simply as possible, when all of Los Angeles was dusty, dirty, mostly adobe or wood homes, no one had sewers, no one had fresh running water, you could talk about Mexican or Chinese people being dirty all you wanted to, but you still went home to a house that was effectively just as dirty as theirs, right? And you lived in a neighborhood that was just as dirty as the neighborhood those people lived in, and your store was just as dirty as a store owned by a person of color. But by the mid-1890s, that had changed. And the European American Business District was tall, and it was paved, and it had streetcars. And there were sewers that served those neighborhoods. And the people who worked in those houses went home to this new wave of middle-class housing where the neighborhoods were paved and had sewers and running water and water closets. And only a few blocks away, like literally you could cross the street, turn a corner from Belgian block, two-story buildings, the hustle and bustle, and you would be on an unpaved street in the Mexican or Chinese district where there were no sewers, and you had to walk planks across like cesspools and running gutters in the street. And so then, and my argument actually is that, to me, this is what actually breaks the possibility of intercultural relationships, is that for everyone who says that Mexican and Chinese people are backwards and dirty, it starts to look like they're backwards and dirty because you've created this spatial asymmetry. And so by choosing to build your city unequally, you've made it possible to racialize the people who live in it according to the space they live in.
Mm-hmm. So in your first chapter, you're describing how this intercultural, if not idyllic, kumbaya society, but a functioning intercultural society is fashioned. And then, so you describe that in the first chapter, but then over the course of the next 5 chapters, you have 6 chapters, you're describing how that those networks become unraveled and then rebuilt and kind of solidified in the form of these sewage infrastructures or water infrastructures. Is that
Absolutely
fair? So what, from that story, so you're starting in the kind of Spanish, then Mexican context, and you take us up to, in chapter 6, Toberman. What are some of the flashpoints from the vantage point of being done with the book, having it look like this?
Right.
What are some of the flashpoints, or like the things that really stand out for you in your memory, or things that you find you're always chewing on, or that come back to you every so often, or things that you're remembering more now?
Yeah, I would say I think that's a really great question. So I would say one is the difficulty of the work that was done. And again, I don't want to gloss this, right? Because the people who did this work were white people who owned slaves or white people who supported slavery. They were Spanish Mexicans who like used everything other than chattel slavery to control Indian labor and bodies, right? But they did difficult work in the face of migration, colonization, a clash of two nations, to build families, to build businesses, and to build a community that overcame differences on paper that looked like they're difficult to overcome, right? So when I first came to this story, what I expected already in the 1840s was to find, the European American people arrayed against the Mexican people, right? And that they were going to battle and they were going to do battle. And the question was like, how did all this like racism go down? And what I found out actually is that the racism that went down was between the elites of both of those groups against poor people, against browner Mexicans, against indigenous people, against Chinese people, and even against poor white people who were, the subject of vigilante killings by interracial lynch mobs as much as Chinese and Mexicans. And that was surprising. But in the last few days in particular, I've been trying to think about like the negotiations, right? Like the people who submitted petitions after the US Army invaded about having like their houses looted. And that those people still made family with people from the United States. They built businesses together. Like they found a way forward, even though it was hard. And I think like, there are, you know, beautiful episodes of discomfort and uncomfortableness and people dealing with uncomfortableness. And I think, like, especially in light of the last few weeks, that's something that's definitely come further back into my conscious than it has since I finished working on the book. You know, the other two things that have continued with me, one is like the big lesson is to have the disadvantage of hindsight when we look back at the past from the present. And instead the need to look forward from the present to the possibilities that the future holds. And I think that's helped me sort of both be scared and also be maybe optimistic about what opportunity might be in front of us, without in any way glossing over how like narrow the needle is to thread. And I think the other thing that has stayed with me that I've had a hard time reconciling, and that has been coming up to me in ways that I've yet to find effectively to write about it, is to think about violence and the violence that communities perpetrate against members of their community outside the formal boundaries of the law.
Mm-hmm.
In the book, I talk about how this sort of shared extra-legal violence by this elite group of Spanish Mexicans and European Americans helps solidify the community. It helps bring the community together. And it came to this terrifying realization that that kind of violence does productive social work, that it can actually stitch a community together. And the same thing has been argued by people who study lynching in the South. And so when I look at the present, what I want to ask myself, you know, before is, what is the social work that police officers killing people of color does for communities, right? That they rarely get indicted, they almost never get convicted, even though their murders are extra legal, right? So what is it that communities are getting from murderous police? Why is it in their best interest to continue to support this kind of organization? And the interesting thing right now is that I think I've never imagined that so many people would actually start asking that same question, like, why are we continuing to do this when this is destroying our society? And maybe we've gotten to the point where it doesn't bind society together. And so in that sense, I'm sorry for monologuing, the 1871 Chinese massacre, anti-Chinese massacre, has been at the forefront of my mind, because in my thinking about that, that's a moment where, and I talk a lot about this, I don't want to take up all the time, my interpretation of that moment is that Spanish Mexicans and European Americans tried to get together in this really difficult moment, right? That is the same part of the 1872 election, to find a way where shared extra-legal violence against Chinese people can stitch their community back together. And it goes horribly awry. And it becomes something they can't do again. And the loss of that as a resource, the loss of shared violence as a resource, also tears this community apart. And I've been wondering if what we're seeing in the response over the last 2 weeks is like that this time, this is too much. And that like people have come to an awareness that it can't be like this. And so the question is, like, again, in the present, how do we validate this, right? But thinking about the past, it's just been instructive to me to try to imagine what the future might be like.
You just hit on like all, I have 10 questions in a row, and you just like hit all the high notes there. But I'll try to take everything that you just said and turn it towards both pedagogic questions, and also give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about your current work, which is about the Chinese in Merced. So how am I going to get there in 2 questions? Well, first, I guess I'm just interested in hearing you talk a little bit about how your research, and obviously your research is very personal and informing just how you move through your life. But how does your research inform your teaching? Like, how do you bring these observations to the classroom, or like, how do you explain to 18-year-olds who've got all sorts of stuff on their minds? How do you explain to them like why history is important? And then, I guess this is a pedagogical question, like how do you turn these towards your kind of site-specific research in Merced? So 2 smushy questions, so you can pick any piece of that to respond to.
I appreciate that. So I would say like that the biggest ways that I bring the like broad outlines of my research into the classroom are first this necessity of engaging in difficult issues, the necessity of trying to wrap our arms around them and embrace them. They are part of our past, right? They are part of who we are. This is especially true of histories of violence and displacement, right? Like there's no getting away from those parts of our past. And so the only thing we can do is to look at them, try to come to an understanding of them, and to take them into our individual and social and collective body, right? And like let that discomfort percolate in us and lead to different choices, right? And that sounds like incredibly idealistic, but you know, I think, and again, to sort of like cite maybe writing that is complicated or not as well loved as it might be, but like I think this is part of the thesis of Borderlands La Frontera for Gloria Anzaldúa, and a lot of Borderlands scholarship, right? And the thesis of like Leslie Silko's Ceremony, right, which I try to teach whenever I can, because it's it really gets the students into this notion of how you have to bring the uncomfortable parts of the past with you into the present. Otherwise, there's actually no point, right? Like this, I tell my students on the first day that if they're looking for a celebratory narrative of history, that like they're wrong. And if they think that I'm gonna like love someone, what they'll find out, because of what students always write when I teach the survey of US history, is that I don't like anybody. And it's not that I don't like anybody, it's that we're all people who make like countless mistakes, right? And if someone's doing a lecture on all the things I screwed up, like they wouldn't like me either. And so the idea behind this is to use the past as an instructive tool for thinking about complexity, and especially for students. And this is not to speak ill of students. This is to speak ill of what's happened to public education since, you know, 2 plucky kids in the San Fernando Valley attended Walter Reed Junior High School. That the schools hide the students from complexity, and that the testing regimes discourage teachers from embracing issues of complexity. And so the need to get the students to think about like, yeah, the world you live in today is incredibly complex, and it also has been for a really long period of time. And so how have people approached complexity over time to give you some tools and resources? The second, which is the thing that I sort of came to as I did my research, which is the need to learn not only by reading, but by seeing. Anyone who's ever seen me try to draw or had a discussion with me knows that like I'm not a visual thinker. Like I really need words. I'm great at talking, obviously, and I'm sorry. But like to learn to look at images, to look around you, to think about the space you live in. You know, I teach a US urban history class that has a component where I send my students out to go do mental mapping assignments in Merced, and to get them to like think about the city where they live in, and to, like just to look, not to read books. The nice thing about, or the not nice thing about living in the Central Valley is that like there's almost no scholarship on Merced in the Central Valley. So instead of giving the students a stack of books like I would if I was teaching about LA, I just send them out. Like, go look at the city and see what you can figure out about its history by looking.
I'm gonna get that.
I teach images all the. Okay, I'll send it to you. Okay. I teach images all the time in class, and that's because I think we can learn so much if we look at advertisements, at films, at pictures of the past, which is why I love the Picturing Mexican American project. That there's so much more to learn there, and then. Just like I've tried to learn from my research, I try really hard to create an inclusive class and to learn from my students, right? I've learned so much from going and being a historian about the past, things that I would have never thought. Like, it's just surprising if you stop and pay attention what you hear. And so I try to bring that into the classroom. You know, a lot of this is informed by feminist and women of color pedagogies, right? But my alleged expertise doesn't drive what we do in the classroom. And I do write the syllabus because that's my job, but we try to bring the students' experiences into class and to create an inclusive space. And I think for me, that's the segue to kind of the work that I'm doing in Merced on all 3 of those components. And so the project I'm working on now deals with the Chinese community of Merced. Merced California. It's in the Central Valley. If you don't know it, it's on the road between Fresno and Sacramento on Highway 99. It's a place with a longer agricultural history. Its deeper history is as a place of seasonal forage for indigenous communities. It's in a very low part of the Central Valley, and so seasonally it was a swamp. But they basically drew the line of the transcontinental, not the transcontinental, but the connecting railroad from San Francisco to Los Angeles through the Central Valley. Merced became a place when the railroad came through, but it became the county seat in 1871. And so it's a very small version of a Sudden city, but it draws in people who've been living in higher parts of the San Joaquin Valley to it, including a pretty large Chinese community. That community is segregated, marginalized, as all Chinese communities are in 19th century California, grows and thrives, and then slowly dwindles as a result of Chinese exclusion and people moving to other places. And then in the early 1960s, the county of Merced uses the opportunity to build Highway 99 to bulldoze the Chinese district. And so it is literally erased from the landscape. It is, when you drive through Merced, there's a small wiggle in Highway 99, and that wiggle exists so that it could bulldoze Chinatown. There's very few descendants from that Chinese community who still live in the Central Valley. And so we have this kind of lost history. And there's an effort that I'm undergoing to recover it. And we're doing that in part by thinking about the space, right? One of the challenges of writing American Chinese, like immigrants from China to the United States from the 1850s to the early 1900s back into the historical record, is we have a shockingly small number of the things that historians like to have, like diaries and letters and treatises and newspapers, whether written in Chinese or in any other language. And so we don't have a lot to go on to hear Chinese voices. And as a result, Chinese people have been objects rather than subjects in even the best research about them. And we think of Chinese in the history of the 19th century, we think of exclusion, of marginalization, right, of discrimination. And so the effort here is to try to think about how Chinese people understood themselves and the community around them by thinking about how they organized their space and what they did with it as a different way of hearing their voices. And so it involves a lot of looking at maps, looking at tax records, and not just to come up with this very positivist, geographic-centered reconstruction of the Chinese community, which we're getting close to having for about 30 to 40 years, taxpayer by taxpayer, year by year in space, which is awesome. But also to think about the ways that doing this work sort of summons the ghosts of that Chinese community and gives them opportunities to speak to us and to complicate these histories. And in doing this project, I've been collaborating with my undergraduate students, and it's been like an incredible opportunity. This is my 4th summer working on different parts of this project with my undergraduate students. I am working with 7 students this summer. This is a research that's sponsored in part by the University of California, Merced, in a grant that I had no part in getting that came from the Andrew Mellon Foundation. But it's been a fantastic opportunity to mentor undergraduate students. And for those who are interested in historical study and museum work, it's been an engine to get them into graduate school and into professional programs. And then I think the next big question to think about is how their voices come back into the research, right? Like, these are not my research assistants. They're writing their own projects. They're writing theses. I'm co-authoring a paper with a student who's now a graduate student, but it's research that we did together when she was an undergraduate, right? And so how do we shake the cage a little bit of the academy to listen to undergraduate voices, especially undergraduate voices who are women of color, and to accept their words as on par with those who have been more properly blessed by the institution, as people who can make a contribution to conversations about the past.
Yeah, and in the process, really challenging our conceptions of what research is and who conducts research and what it means to know things and how we make knowledge. It's awesome, David. It's awesome. So
thanks, Marissa.
You're welcome. So you published, you just talked about publishing a paper with a student. And I know we've talked in conversation about the question of book.
Right.
The gold standard in academia, but
yes,
maybe that's changing, or maybe this work will sort of force a change, this kind of work.
Yeah, I'm hoping so. I think it is at least an opportunity to provoke a conversation about what a different model of research looks like, right? One that has this large archive building component to it, a multi-authored writing component to it. And I think, you know, this is a particularity of the humanities, that when we look at the social scientists and the hard scientists, and I think sometimes we, like, I don't know, you see someone and they have like 93 papers on their CV and you're like, how much of that work did you actually do, right? But the other part of that is that, like, when we work together in teams, we have more voices in the space and the work gets more interesting. And so I did sort of set out intentionally with this project. Part of it is going to be more technologically sophisticated than I can handle. So I knew I needed to work in a team. But part of it also is that I didn't want to spend another 5 years like alienated from my family conducting research and writing by myself and having these ideas live in my head until I could share them out. And this notion of like being able to work with others and to try to develop what a collaborative, multi-authored approach to writing history looks like is actually something that I'm curious about. And hopefully, like, it doesn't result in my career lying in ruins at the end as a failed experiment, but I'm really committed to the experiment, and I'm okay if that's the outcome.
Yeah, I'm sure it won't. It sounds like it's going to be about as hard as building a city from nothing.
Exactly.
As the settlers did. Well, I know it's late, and I don't want to keep you much longer. I just want to say thank you for doing this again, and thank you for all the great work you're doing. And I remember when we did this on Instagram, at one point you pulled yourself back from yourself, and you said, I don't mean to get on a soapbox. And we had like about 5 different people who commented all at once, like, more soapbox. So it's great to talk with you as always. So hang in there, David. It's good to see you.
Thanks so much, Marissa. I really appreciate this. I really appreciate the work of Picturing Mexican America and the opportunity to come and be part of this space with you. Thank you so much.
You'll be back.
I can't wait.
All right. Take care, David.